Welcome everybody to this conversation on Afghanistan, hosted by Providence, a Journal of Christianity and American Foreign Policy. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy and editor of Providence. We're delighted that we have two well-informed perspectives being presented here, one by Paul Miller, a contributor to Providence and a professor at Georgetown University with deep knowledge and experience regarding Afghanistan, which he will share with you. Our other spokesperson, conversation partner, John Askonas, a professor at Catholic University, also with deep knowledge and experience in international relations. They come from different perspectives on America's role in the world, so I don't know, but I expect they will have some differences of opinion about recent events in Afghanistan and lessons that should be drawn from them. But we will have a vigorous conversation, you can be assured. This is being broadcast live on Providence Facebook, and the video will be downloaded onto YouTube. So if you have friends who would like to view it, please encourage them to do so. If you're here for the first time at a Providence event and you're not on our invitation list, please let me know so I can add you. Our next event will be September 10th, which is next Friday. Regarding recalling the events of 9/11, 20 years ago. So obviously related to this evening's conversation. That will be hosted by our executive editor of Providence and Just War scholar, Mark Levesque, and the guests will be, Mark?
Victoria Clark, who used to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Communication under Donald Rumsfeld, and Lieutenant Colonel Joe Chapa, who is an RPA pilot in the U.S. Air Force.
So join us next Friday evening if you're able. I don't think we've ever hosted a Friday evening event before, so this will be a test. Are Washingtonians willing to come to a Friday evening public policy event? I don't know the answer to that question. Our speakers will each speak for 10 minutes, and then each will have 5 minutes to respond to the other, and then we'll go directly to questions and comments from the audience and hope to conclude by 7:30, but you're all welcome to linger afterwards for further conversation and to consume what's left of the food and drink within reason. And I commend you for your boldness and not being intimidated by the weather this evening. So Paul Miller, if you're willing to go first, and we appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and IRD and Providence. And thank you, John, for talking with all of us tonight. Mark asked me to talk for 10 minutes about Afghanistan. I reminded him I can talk for 5 hours about Afghanistan. And there are podcast episodes out there to prove it. I also reminded him that there's a tornado watch tonight, and he said, and I quote, exciting. How to summarize my reaction to what's happening in Afghanistan. The mission is not over. The mission is not over. Al-Qaeda still exists, unfortunately. That's the shortest way I can put it. Al-Qaeda exists now. ISIS exists. The mission is not accomplished. The suicide bombing at the Kabul airport demonstrates the continuing threat of international terrorism in Afghanistan. Our presence for the past 20 years, I believe, helped keep jihadists on the run, helped keep the lid on that problem, helped keep them focused on avoiding our own airstrikes and special forces. And now they will have time and space to breathe, which means room to plan, recruit, train, fundraise, and attack. That's my main reaction to what's happening in Afghanistan. We were not losing this war. And the ending, as it unfolded these last few weeks, was not inevitable. The main message from the Biden administration has been that this was inevitable. We had, in fact, already lost this war long ago, and he just needed to rip the Band-Aid off to acknowledge the reality that we had lost, and he claims that the chaos proves his point that it was always going to be this way. It's not true. From 2014 onward, as we began to withdraw from the war, the Taliban did not make rapid gains or control more territory. Far more territory was contested, that's true, But the Taliban only marginally increased its control as we withdrew. We had 30,000 troops in country in 2014 and began to draw down from there. According to the Special Inspector General of Afghan Reconstruction, they charted how many districts each side controlled, and the government did lose its control of some, more were contested, but that's understandable when you have a brand new Afghan army that has just been stood up and is beginning to take leadership of security in the country as we transition to them. And so there was an ongoing civil war, but the war was not lost. And it's false, and it's even mendacious for the Biden administration to claim that it had been lost, to pretend as if they could see into the future, to borrow that future knowledge and to use it to justify their decisions in the present, which then bring about the very situation they predicted, and they can call themselves vindicated. Their predictions of loss became a self-fulfilling prophecy. In fact, there were important successes. There were no large-scale international terrorist attacks coming from South Asia for the past 20 years, in part because of our military presence there. We can also credit our improved homeland defense, of course, but the fact that our presence was there, again, kept the bad guys on the run. We can also see that the Afghan government, while corrupt and had plenty of problems, stood on the foundations of a constitution that was widely popular with the Afghans. You hear sometimes now that we should do nation building, democracy wasn't a good fit in Afghanistan. That is nonsense. The Afghans wrote their own democratic constitution. We did not do that. And they held repeated rounds of elections, marred by corruption, but they loved the principle of majority rule, of human rights, of representative institutions. Year after year, survey after survey, the Afghans always said they loved it, they just wanted it to work better. The Afghan economy showed consistent growth by virtually every single metric. Afghan life was better a month ago than it had been 20 years ago. Those were all successes that will now be undone. The war was sustainable. The war was low cost, it was low risk, there was no meaningful anti-war movement in the United States, there was no domestic political pressure to withdraw, no election was going to hinge on whether or not we had 2,000 or 5,000 troops in Afghanistan. There was no prevailing need, no compelling reason for this withdrawal. President Biden claims that his choice was to leave completely, which he did, or to escalate dramatically. He said repeatedly in his speeches these past 2 weeks that to sustain the war, he had to send in tens of thousands of more troops, implying that we had to go back to the situation about 10 years ago when President Obama had 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan. Again, this is false. I'm going to bore you with some statistics here, but bear with me. In 2014, we had 30,000 troops in country, and that year, there was 55 American killed in action in Afghanistan. 55. Do not say that to make light of the loss of life. That number includes a friend of mine. But I do want to give you some historical perspective that this was barely a war on the American side. In the 6.5 years since then, from the end of 2014 forward until just last month, there was only 66 American killed in action in all 6.5 years combined. We were not in harm's way. We were not at the front lines. We were not in ground combat in large numbers. This was a very small military action for the United States. And so for President Biden to suggest that it was unsustainable is false. And even at an earlier stage in 2014 with 30,000 troops, it was sustainable at that level. When there was 10 times the number of troops as were there just earlier this year, it was still a sustainable war. Now, I don't know what the magic number is. I don't know how many troops we needed. It certainly was not 100,000. But if we could have stabilized the war at 30,000 troops at the cost of a couple of dozen casualties, I'd say that's a sustainable war. And so the president was wrong to suggest this was unsustainable, and he had the choice to either completely withdraw or escalate dramatically. That's just simply not true. The president also said that the Afghan army didn't fight, and he used that to justify his claim that this war was lost. If they folded like a house of cards, after 20 years of training, how much longer did he want to give it? It's clear that they weren't going to fight to defend their country. I'd observe that they did stand and fight for 10 years, from the time the United States took leadership of the effort to train the Afghan army until this spring. The Afghan army stood and fought. 60,000 of them died in combat. against our common enemies. For the president to suggest otherwise, his casual, flippant dismissal of their sacrifice is appalling, it is unpresidential, and it's racist. The Afghan army collapsed when he took away their air support, when he catalyzed a collapse of their morale by saying that we're leaving before the job was done. It is him, not the Afghan soldier, who's responsible for the performance of the Afghan army in the final weeks of the war. Now, I understand critics say we can't stay forever. But I respond, we can't fight wars on timetables. There is not a single field manual, a single strategist, a single book of military strategy that says, go to war on timetables. I've read these books. They don't say that. Timetables equals losing wars. The next time you hear a president say, I'm going to end the war, what he's really saying is, I'm going to lose this war. When you start hearing that language of withdraw, timetables, exit strategies, we've lost. This war in Afghanistan, if it was lost as early as December of 2009, when President Obama first began that language of withdrawal, of ending the war on a timetable. If you see an importance here to defeat international terrorism, to defeat Al-Qaeda, to keep ourselves safe, you have to understand that to fight that war smartly, it does necessarily have to be open-ended. You know what else was open-ended? World War II was open-ended. When we declared war on Germany and Japan, we didn't do it with a timetable. We didn't say, we're going to fight as hard as we can for 2.5 years. We didn't say that. No, we said we're going to fight till the job is done. And so yes, this has to be an open-ended commitment. I don't think it would be forever. Imagine for a moment if 20 years ago we had said, we're going to go to war for 20 years, instead of saying every single year, we're going to fight and we're probably leaving pretty soon. Right? I can imagine that would look very different. We telegraphed our eagerness to get out every single year, and that undermined the progress we were otherwise making. Finally, I just want to say this has nothing to do with nation building. Some people will say that this proves that nation building doesn't work. We shouldn't have tried nation building. It was too hubristic. It was too ambitious. Look, we didn't do any nation building in Afghanistan, except for a very short window, 2007 to 2011, where we dumped a lot of money on the place. But before then and after then, there was no nation building. It was just counter-terrorist whack-a-mole. So let's just remove that from the debate altogether. This is not a discussion about whether or not nation building was a good idea, a bad idea, effective, ineffective, because we just didn't do it. Right? So take that out of your minds. This is not a debate about nation building. The myth of the inevitability of our loss is a comforting myth. Because if it's true, it says we were actually powerless all along, and we could never have prevented this, and it's not our fault. We, the most powerful nation in the history of the world, were actually powerless, and we couldn't have done it. It's much easier to believe that comforting myth than to believe the reality of our agency, and therefore our responsibility, and therefore our moral betrayal of the Afghan people. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Paul. I was, originally Mark had invited me to speak on a panel discussion about Afghanistan. He didn't tell me he was going to pit me against one of the most eloquent defenders of a robust presence in Afghanistan. I really appreciate Paul Miller. He's one of, they're in a town of a lot of people with a lot of empty talk and a lot of decisions made about other people's money, other people's lives. I've always felt that Paul put his money where his mouth is. He served in Afghanistan. He's also always been very intellectually honest about the implications of his positions. He didn't want to talk nation building tonight, which is fine, but he'll defend it, and he'll defend it honestly. So I appreciate talking with Paul. And I should also say I know a lot less about Afghanistan than Paul. Paul is a real Afghanistan expert. When we were colleagues at the Clements Center, he would lament that he had a massive sprawling trilogy on the Afghan war planning to write, but he couldn't get a contract for it because the war wouldn't end. It kept not ending. So congratulations, Paul. You can finally get your contract. You can finally write the history of the United States involvement in Afghanistan. But I think Paul is wrong about our presence in Afghanistan and about our withdrawal. And I think he's wrong on moral grounds, practical grounds, and strategic grounds. At the very end, after speaking very eloquently for 10 minutes, Paul actually didn't say very much about why we should be in Afghanistan. He gave two recommendations on the need to fight international terrorism, and as he threw in at the end there, a moral obligation to the Afghan people. Now, I think our moral obligation to the Afghan people cuts in the other direction. There is a direct negative correlation between the sustainability of the war for us and the sustainability of the war for the Afghan people. Right? The same Cigar reports that spoke about Taliban advances also said in plain language that the war was increasingly unsustainable for the level of losses that the Afghan National Army was taking. In addition, one of the reasons the war became so sustainable for us is that we had so little presence on the ground. We were relying more and more on working by, with, and through Afghan partners and using airstrikes. That led to an over 300% increase in civilian casualties. This recent drone strike on our way out of Afghanistan, where it appears, if everyone involved is to be believed, we may have killed one would-be ISK terrorist and killed 10 civilians, including 6 children, is pretty emblematic of our presence in Afghanistan. So I believe that jus in bello requires us to have a compelling reason to continue to inflict casualties and lead to loss of life. And that if there is a method by which peace, understood as a reduction in loss of life, could come to Afghanistan, we ought to take it. And I believe that this withdrawal furthers that effort, even if not in the political terms that we would most like. The second point is a practical one. Paul has said we need to be in Afghanistan in order to fight international terrorism, and that if we don't fight Al-Qaeda or ISIS in Afghanistan, then we'll have to fight them on our shores. We've been hearing this tired rhetoric for over 20 years. Frankly, if there's going to be one safe haven for terrorism in the world, I would pray for it to be Afghanistan, which is about as far away from any vital American interest as possible. If you read the 9/11 Commission report, what you'll find is that they spend very little time on and put very little emphasis on the possibility of an Al-Qaeda safe haven in Afghanistan. Right? 9/11 happened because of major failures in American intelligence, criminal investigations, homeland security, border and immigration issues, intelligence fusion, our oversight of global financial networks, and frankly, political will. The Clinton administration was incredibly confused in and apathetic towards the threat of terrorism in the second Clinton administration. And the 2000 election delayed even minor action against Al-Qaeda after the USS Cole attack. And the Bush administration unfortunately arrived, didn't make it as much a priority as it might have in retrospect when it first began. This is not a problem we have anymore. Thanks largely to the major reform efforts undertaken since 9/11, we have a huge counterterrorism apparatus with global surveillance capabilities and global strike capabilities, which did not exist in 2001. So if it's a trade-off, if the question is, what is it worth to forfend the possibility of international terrorism, it's on Paul or those who are defending the war in Afghanistan to argue that this loss of life is a necessary component of that, and I'm not convinced that it is. In addition, we have a deal with the Taliban about Al-Qaeda's presence, and you might not believe it's credible, but you can certainly believe that the American people would support strikes in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda if the intelligence supported that. The lack of political will is no longer an issue. In addition, this is something that neither supporters or detractors of the Afghan withdrawal have really discussed. But as Paul said, this is not the end of our war in Afghanistan either. This is the end of putting American soldiers in harm's way needlessly. This is the end of supporting a feckless and corrupt and unworkable Afghan state. I agree with Paul, actually. The problem is not Afghan democracy. The problem is not even the Afghan nation. The problem is the kind of state that we sought to build in Afghanistan, which has never existed in Afghanistan, and which, frankly, by everything we know in political science about state building, Afghanistan is about the least likely kind of place for the centralized state that we sought to build. We still have other elements of national power, including clandestine and covert options, and letting go of our obligation to support the Afghan state overtly opens up many covert options, which any competent American president would take. The other problem for Paul's position is that the face of terrorism has changed. You could perhaps argue in the year 2000 or 2001 that you needed some sort of physical safe haven for terrorists to come together and scheme. Well, now we have a global safe haven called the internet that terrorists and jihadists have shown themselves very able to use to recruit Afghanistan, one of the most remote places in the world, to meet and discuss. So that's the practical consequence. The strategic consequence is, the strategic dimension of this is, the United States only has limited resources. And we need to use those resources as ably and carefully as possible. And while a commitment of, say, $50 billion a year and 15 to 30,000 troops a year is not unsustainable from the perspective of the overall American budget, it does still represent a significant commitment of both of American combat power and, frankly, as a bargaining chip or even a hostage that a near-peer adversary could use against us, right? While we now know that, and suspect at the time, that rumors about Russian bounties to the Taliban were false, leaving a large presence very far away for a long period of time is asking for trouble, right? And whether the Taliban or others would take advantage of that is something only time would tell. And again, the impetus is on those defending the continuation of the war to make a strong case for its necessity. The last thing I want to leave with is this. Paul said that there was no anti-war movement. And that's true in a sense, right? There's nothing like the massive marches in protest of the Iraq War. But I don't think it's true in another sense. There have been some severe domestic repercussions of our ongoing support for the war in Afghanistan. Both President Trump in 2016 and now President Biden have made significant political gains by calling for an end to these wars because the American people are sick of them. And a subset of people who have borne the greatest cost of these wars are very sick of them and increasingly willing to, and I want to use my words carefully here, but increasingly desperate for a foreign policy which takes their lives seriously and the lives of their loved ones. Research by political scientists showed that electoral districts that had higher rates of casualties, wounded and killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, supported President Trump over Hillary Clinton in 2016 by statistically significant measures. And if the numbers that are believed, at least cost her Michigan and possibly other states. Right? This is having a significant influence on our domestic politics. Right? As anyone who has read our founding documents or what our founders believed about republicanism would understand already. We cannot. President Biden was correct when he said that there's no such thing as a low-cost or low-risk war. And so, even though the withdrawal was handled terribly, and we can discuss some of the reasons for that and what might have done differently, what a better withdrawal would have looked like, I am very glad that the war in Afghanistan is long last over. Thank you. You're up.
Yeah.
So John has asked me to explain why Afghanistan was important. Somewhat dismissive of the idea that a safe haven is meaningful to terrorists. I guess I would ask, if it's not that meaningful, why did they spend all this time fighting to get it back? It's true that there are other terrorist safe havens in the world. Afghanistan and Western Pakistan, together South Asia, is unique on the jihadist map. It is the headquarters. It's the location of the densest network of overlapping jihadist groups. Most people think that's the Middle East. It's not true. It's actually in Afghanistan and Western Pakistan. This is where Al-Qaeda was born. This is where Lashkar-e-Taiba exists, which is actually one of the largest and most active of these jihadist groups. When they have a physical safe haven, as opposed to the internet, they gather together like this, in rooms. They create networks and relationships. That's what originated 9/11. Yes, there was flaws in Homeland Security and failures along the way, but it originated in the relationships and networks of fervently committed jihadists who were able to develop those relationships over years of training together, fighting together, working together, literally living together at Tarnak Farms in Kandahar and other training places. The physical safe haven really does matter. They take inspiration from each other. 9/11 doesn't happen. You know what happens with an internet safe haven? Are lone wolf attacks. Self-radicalized individuals who read a message board, they get radicalized, and they drive a truck through a crowd, or they buy an AK or an AR and they gun down a crowd. Those are terrible things, but is worlds away from a 9/11. A 9/11 scale attack requires the imagination and the visionary output that comes from those overlapping networks. So denying a physical safe haven in the headquarters of global jihad is essential to our national security. That's why Afghanistan is singularly important. That's why it's worth a continuing military presence there. John has raised another point about the effect of this war on our domestic politics and the sort of long-term consequences of a long-term military operation internationally. When I think about our presence on the international stage, and I think about our presence in Afghanistan, I think that staying and fighting there would have been less damaging than leaving the way we did. So if we're worried about our stature on the international stage, I'd say staying was the lesser of evil of the two options. Think about the damage done to our alliances and our friendships around the world through our departure. And even if you could imagine it was done competently, it was still done mostly unilaterally. The Allies did not like us with the pace and timing of this withdrawal. We did serious damage to NATO and to our alliances through our unilateral withdrawal. I imagine that our adversaries have taken heart from our apparent lack of commitment, from our lack of perseverance, and from the perception that the United States will tolerate losing. We'll tolerate losing if winning just seems too expensive. What lesson do you think China is taking right now about Taiwan, or Russia is taking about Ukraine? I think that our adversaries are taking note. Finally, let's talk about at home. I think John is right that there is a effect that war has on the body politic that we've got to be concerned about. But there's also an effect to losing a war. When you lose a war, as we have just done, there is a demoralization, a loss of confidence, belief that we cannot, should not stand for something in the world anymore. That's a world I'm afraid to live in. And I'm afraid we just took our first steps into that world. So you need to weigh which cost you're willing to pay. Living in that world, or the cost of an enduring military presence to fight our adversaries overseas. That's the question before us.
So Paul raises the question of international credibility, which is the last refuge of intellectual scoundrels in foreign policy. I'll say this, the academic consensus and the historical consensus on this is that credibility doesn't work that way. In 1967, the intelligence community produced an eyes-only national intelligence estimate for President Johnson, where this question was posed: what will happen to our credibility if we leave Vietnam? And the answer, the consensus answer from the intelligence community was not a thing. Because our credibility does not reside on the fact that people like us or think that we're loyal. It resides in the fact that other allies believe they understand our interests and they understand what we do with our resources. Right now, it's been said that this will damage that this was unilateral. I think of the sort of the story of the red hen, where if you aren't baking the cake, you don't get to eat. You don't get the benefit at the end. Our allies were free to step up at any point in this long campaign. Some of them did more than others, and many of the ones who are complaining most loudly, with the exception maybe the British, were not so helpful. But I'll believe it when I see it when it comes to concerns about NATO credibility and whatnot. I'm keeping a close eye on the percentage of GDP spent on defense, and my bet is that it does not budge a lick, because you cannot stand up in the Bundestag and make the case for expanding German defense based on America pulling out of Afghanistan. And to the last point about our enemies might take from this, I'll note that both Russia and China have complained about the security vacuum we're leaving in Afghanistan, which I hope one of them will be generous enough to fill, so that we can return to the halcyon days of 1980. But in any case, it's hard. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan. I don't know what more you want out of perseverance and endurance. Right. Now, to the question of international terrorism, again, I think we have to point out two things. One, there is a question of trade-offs. There's no question that, all told, we should do what we can to prevent recurrence of 9/11. Right? The question is, at what cost? Right? And what cost, and using what means? Right? If we're spending, if we have 30,000 troops on the ground and spending $40 or $50 billion a year on this, could we? How much? You can buy a lot of intelligence. So you can buy a pretty substantial human intelligence network for $40 billion in Afghanistan, not one of the world's leading developed countries. So, if anything, if you wanted to be particularly cynical, you could argue this is our chance to sort of take the gloves off, in a sense. To the point about planning and the utility of safe havens for planning, I'm simply not as convinced as Paul is of their importance. You'll note that of the 9/11 plan, Paul said that Al-Qaeda was founded in Afghanistan. That's technically true. It was founded by Saudi nationals who were fighting in the war against the Soviet Union. It was funded by the Saudis. President Biden still has not released classified documents about the role of Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East in funding the 9/11 attacks. None of the major plotters or planners of the 9/11 attacks were Afghan. As far as I can tell, with substantial investigation, only maybe one or two were caught in Afghanistan. Right, the vast majority of people involved in 9/11 that were captured or killed by the United States were captured or killed elsewhere in the world. In Germany, in Yemen, in the Philippines, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq. Hardly any of them in Afghanistan. Right. The Taliban and some of the other groups that Paul mentioned are primarily indigenous movements aimed at building an Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan and serving the interests of the Pakistani ISI. I expect that they will continue to do that. And if they venture into transnational jihadist terrorism again, well, our B-52s haven't gone anywhere. Again, I feel like the impetus is on those wishing to defend staying in Afghanistan to do so forcefully after a cost of 20 years and many lives and literally trillions of dollars. Thank you. You want to, yeah.
Paul and John.
So, questions?
I guess this question is for Paul.
Sure.
I shared a lot of your opinions that I heard tonight and I've heard the last week or so. I also discussed it with how the administration has pulled out. But I was confused by how you compared this to World War II and said in World War II we didn't fight the timetable, we fought till the job was done. Because in World War II we knew from the get-go what it would look like when the job was done. And even though I oppose, and I'm sure will oppose for a long time, how we pulled out from Afghanistan, it wasn't clear to me that anyone knew what it would look like when the job was done. Every administration since the Bush administration has basically failed to articulate what the job would really was, what it would look like when it was done. They've all basically said sometimes these almost exact words that victory is essentially impossible to achieve. So what would a done job look like in Afghanistan? Or do you agree that the job would never be done and it would just be professional?
Thanks for the question. First, the point of the World War II analogy is just to say we don't fight wars on timetables. No strategist recommends that. We shouldn't try that ever again. What would victory look like in Afghanistan? The sort of lowest level of success, I'd say, is an Afghan army that can fight on its own. Now you might think, well, right there, I just admitted defeat because we saw what the Afghan army did in those last few weeks. And I want to tell you the story of how the Afghan army was improving. In 2001, the Afghan army did not exist. There wasn't one. There was no Afghan army. We defeated the Afghan, it's called the Taliban, and they left, they collapsed. Right? For 5-6 years, the Germans, the British, and the UN failed in their effort to lead the reconstruction of the Afghan army. We finally took over around 2007, and by 2010, we had a force. And from 2010 to 2020, they fought. That was a force that was improving. The Department of Defense truthfully reported every single year, they're not ready yet. They're making progress, they're not ready yet. We never said they're ready to stand on their own. President Biden knew that. He pulled the plug anyway. Then they collapsed. That's why they collapsed. We knew that was going to happen. They had been making progress. What I'm saying is that vision of success, an Afghan army getting fight on its own, we had been making slow, fitful, incremental progress towards that goal.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Admiral Stavridis wrote a piece last week, basically saying that the army that we were attempting to construct in Afghanistan was never going to succeed, and that we should have attempted to construct a military that looked very different from the one that we were trying to do. And that, do you think that it would have ever been able to stand on its own if we continued on the path that we were continuing in like the same trajectory?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with this critique that the way we built the army was maybe problematic. I have to be a little agnostic because that gets a little outside my expertise. But let's assume that's true. I would say let's stay and reform our efforts to retrain the army, not just leave and give up, right? As long as you stay, you still have the opportunity to change how we're training them, for them to try to change up what they need to change. Again, I'm not the expert here on exactly what the army should look like. I'm just saying, don't go.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Do either of you know much about the status of Christians in Afghanistan today, particularly those that were raised as Muslims? And also, how much do you know about Islamic jihad as far as worldwide thinking, as far as what is happening to the Islamic mind, you know, those that are very serious about their faith?
Is the live stream still on?
Yes, it is.
There are Afghan Christians, and they're still there. Global jihadists are celebrating. Al-Qaeda's chapters around the world are hailing this as a victory for their cause. To them, it's very clear that this is a victory not just for the Taliban, but for all jihadist groups, including ISIS, including Al-Qaeda. All of them are celebrating this as a victory for their global movement.
I read an article interesting about geography and how that played a role in the 20-year conflict. Can you, either of you, speak to the role that geography played in either the continuation of the conflict or of the success or whatnot?
Sure. So, without being too reductionist, there are 3 places in the world that have been 4 places that have basically never had anything like a Westphalian state having any kind of serious power. They are the triple canopy jungle in the northern Amazon, the Zomia, so-called, of the Southeast Asian highlands, the center of Africa, and the Hindu Kush. Right? And the reason is that these geographies are highly isolating. They create a lot of opportunity for linguistic proliferation, which Afghanistan is one of the most dialectically dense places in the world. They create huge, easy opportunities for safe havens and flight across borders. It's very difficult to build a large centralized state. Now, I don't like to say that they are ungovernable, because that's not exactly true either. They have their own governance systems. The Afghan Constitution in 1964 was a pretty good constitution for that. It relied on a king with a lot of legitimacy and not a lot of practical power. Right? The constitution that we bequeathed to the Afghans created a king in place, a president in place of the king that was very powerful and became essentially a dictatorial figure in Afghan politics. So I think the kind of state that we tried to build rendered it impossible. Counterinsurgency experts will tell you that having a safe haven, and I would add a nuclear deterring safe haven in Pakistan, also makes counterinsurgency in the long term essentially impossible. The geographical challenges were very real. I recommend my friend Wes Morgan's book, The Hardest Place, about the American effort in Kunar to get a sense of how geography interacted with our efforts.
Yeah, so mountainous terrain makes governance super expensive and hard and difficult. And one possible way to overcome that is with roads and telecommunications, which is why we should have done more nation building. Right? That would have helped. I want to take issue with your characterization of the Afghan state. The 2004 Constitution is literally a copy-paste from the 1964 Constitution with president substitute for king. The problem isn't what powers were on paper. The problem is that Hamid Karzai actually tried to exercise the powers when the king, a generation earlier, had the common sense not to try to do that. Right? So the problem wasn't us. We didn't write that constitution. The problem was Karzai being a bad politician, I think. And the Afghan state has existed since 1747. It's actually a more real state than most post-colonial states whose borders were drawn by imperial powers. It's not the case for Afghanistan. So it is a real nation, and there's a governability to it, despite the geographic challenges. But it needed better politicians.
Oh, one other thing I'd add is also Afghanistan is one of the most rural, one of the least urbanized states in the world, which also makes governance more of a challenge.
Not true anymore. Kabul is highly urbanized. Right there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, since we're sort of a counterfactual exercise at this point, because we've already left, so the question is, should we have? I'm wondering if we broaden the scope of the counterfactual for each of you, is there a point in the past, perhaps further in the past, where something else should have been done? So, John, would you say that we were correct in going into Afghanistan, but maybe we should have left in, say, the winter of 2001, when there was apparently some offer from the Taliban to surrender? And same question to you. What was the one thing that should have been done differently at some point in the past?
Yeah, this year I got to interview a guy who was the team lead for the Delta Force squadron that was on the ground in Afghanistan, and he told me that he thought it was a mistake to stay past 2001. Now, I don't actually agree with him, but it speaks to the challenges between punishing the Taliban or overthrowing the Taliban and actually building something in its place. It's hard to see politically how this would have worked, but in September 2001, President Bush essentially said the Taliban are not our enemy. Al-Qaeda is our enemy. The Taliban are protecting Al-Qaeda, that makes them our enemy, but that's why they are enemies, because they have protected Al-Qaeda. Sometime between December 2001 and 2003, there were various opportunities to build a Afghan government that included the Taliban. That is what we should have built. That is one of the ways to end wars, is to reintegrate the enemy into the state. And being realistic about it, any Afghan state that included a strong foreign presence and excluded this faction was going to be one in which civil war would continue. So that is what we should have done. What that looks like practically, there's a lot of questions there, but that's my stake.
I've heard this critique a lot, that we should have tried to reach out and include the Taliban at the negotiating table. Look, President Bush made that offer on September 20th, 2001, and they rejected it. Hamid Karzai made that offer daily for years, and the Taliban rejected. Actually, thousands of foot soldiers took him up on it, and they reintegrated. The senior Taliban leadership, by and large, did not take him up on it. The former Taliban defense minister did, and he sat in the Afghan Senate for years. A couple of other high-ranking officials did. They were appointed as governors, and the Taliban assassinated them. Okay, so that tells you that the core of the Taliban consistently rejected being a part of the Afghan government. The onus is on them, not on us. We did our part to reach out and try to include them the best we could. They're the ones who turned that away. Okay, what decisions could we have done otherwise? I point to 4 of them. Number 1, President Bush decided to go in with a light footprint. All kinds of reasons why, but he went in with as little force as possible and with an allergy to nation building. So we approached the most failed state in the world, and we said we're going to do as little as possible. That created a security vacuum, which was the enabling condition for the rise of the Taliban insurgency in 2005-2006. That was a big mistake. We adopted a partial counterinsurgency strategy after that. President Obama, decision number 2, set a withdrawal timetable. I'll say this till my dying day. That was a own goal, right? You don't go to war and announce your own withdrawal dates. And he did it virtually every year of his presidency. Every speech he gave from December 2009 forward was about withdrawing from Afghanistan. That is not wartime leadership, right? So get rid of those timetables. Mistake number 3, Trump's peace deal. It was a surrender deal. And mistake number 4 was Biden's withdrawal. 4 presidents, 4 mistakes, impressively consistent track record of strategic miscalculation.
We agree on that.
Yeah.
Sure.
John, question for you. I hear this narrative from a lot of people, and the administration is saying it a lot, that sort of we've really put Russia and China on the hot seat because now we're not so tangled up in Afghanistan. Can you defend this conjecture? Because to me, I don't see how on earth pulling a small force out of an obscure place, sort of the argument not to be there is that it's so obscure and irrelevant. helps us pivot to China. It just seems like total nonsense and administration spin. But I hear people repeating it and writing Wall Street Journal op-eds and saying, what is the real sort of thoughtful argument for this position?
Well, again, in fairness, most people make this argument, do so as a counter-argument to the equally idiotic idea that we've created a real opportunity for China in Afghanistan. I mean, somebody trotted out this silly Pentagon statistic from 10 years ago that there's $1 trillion worth of minerals in Afghanistan that now the Chinese will have access to. The reality is that Afghanistan doesn't matter very much to us or the Russians or the Chinese. Now, we all share an interest in preventing jihadism from emanating from Afghanistan, and what security cooperation looks like in the future is an interesting question. Does it help us pivot towards near-peer competition? It's small, but it does. It does a few things. It frees up some of our special operations assets, which were pretty critical to getting things to actually work in Afghanistan, but which are a pretty scarce commodity. It frees up planning focus from the Army staff and other staff functions, including CENTCOM. Right? CENTCOM's focus has been Afghanistan and contingency operations for the last 20 years. Right? The CENTCOM could be doing a lot more as part of the counterbalancing Russia and China. And it also potentially frees up security force assistance brigades for operations that support our near-peer efforts rather than just being rotating through Afghanistan every few years. I wouldn't put a lot of weight on it. Again, I don't think it matters very much for that one way or the other.
Yes.
Can I actually ask the same question to you and hear if you have a different response to it?
About the great power competition?
Yes.
Okay, so I recognize that I agree, Afghanistan is not the most important thing in the world. And the fall of Afghanistan isn't like the decisive domino that's going to like catalyze the collapse of the world order. It doesn't have to be for us to care about it, right? Every straw is responsible for breaking the camel's back if it's broken. I'm worried not that China is going to move in and steal that square on the checkerboard. That's not quite the way in which it matters for great power competition. It's more about how the character of world order has changed. If you play chess, you know that you can gauge who's winning by material, by position, and by initiative. That last one, it's hard to quantify, but it's about who's controlling the game, who's setting the agenda, who's driving things forward. We have lost the initiative. We, the free world, have lost the initiative. And it's not so much about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is proof of our loss of initiative, which gives the opportunity to anyone else in the world, yes, including the Chinese, but also including the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, to pick up a tempo, to gain initiative, to push their version of world order forward and ours backwards. That's the way in which this is a loss in great power competition. Tell me.
Yeah, I just wondered, thinking about the future now that the withdrawal has happened, thinking one about great power competition, how do we counter the narrative that the United States is risk-averse, cost-averse? I know within days of the withdrawal beginning, the Chinese state media was already releasing propaganda in Taiwan. Hey, look at these Americans, they cut and run, they're not to be relied upon, remember this if there's ever a war. Certainly, Putin is already looking at this at his ambitions in Eastern Europe. And so, how do we deal with the fact that that perception is very much out there, that we are not willing to pay the cost of advancing our interests? And then also, what does the future of Afghanistan look like? There's certainly resistance to the Taliban, armed resistance to the Taliban that is popping up around Afghanistan. The Taliban does not have the absolute control that they are sometimes portrayed as having. Do we continue to support that, or have we well and truly washed our hands of the place? Kind of, where do we go from here, I guess, is the question.
Sure. To the former point, I mean, so after Vietnam, Vietnam was really, in a way that Afghanistan was not, was really a train wreck for our force posture in Europe, right? We were literally stripping forces out of Germany and France and sending them to Vietnam, right? So how do we reassure our NATO allies after, and by the way, when the Vietnam War ended, right, NATO had pulled, or France had basically pulled out of NATO. It was a huge ignominious defeat. The army was much more demoralized than it is today. And yet that actually laid the foundation for us building a much more powerful military, successful military, and the end of the Cold War. And the way you counterbalance that narrative is put your money where your mouth is, right? We could be doing a lot more to support Taiwan, materially, diplomatically, and otherwise. We can do that, right? We can do a lot more to support our NATO allies, right? And we can put some of those resources we're spending in Afghanistan needlessly directly supporting them, and that's how you build credibility back. And that is also a way in which you can regain the initiative, to Paul's point. If you play chess, you know that holding down losing positions is a way you lose the initiative. I mean, one way you can regain the initiative is sacrificing a losing position and pivoting in a different direction. And remind me second part of your question?
Oh, what's the future of Afghanistan?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's diplomatic. Like, diplomacy has never been in the lead in Afghanistan. Hopefully we'll have some of that. And it's political, and it'll be through our intelligence apparatus, right? Which we had spent many years building up. Which I don't want to talk. There's problems with our intelligence posture that come from our withdrawal. I'll acknowledge that, but we're still going to be involved in Afghanistan. We should still be involved in Afghanistan for the reasons that Paul said.
Just to pick up on that line. So I agree with you about how to pick up the initiative going forward. But in Afghanistan, I would doubt that we have much of an intelligence posture in Afghanistan at all. And my deep concern is that we've lost our eyes and ears. We've lost our facilities, our listening posts, and we've probably lost quite a lot of our human sources, at least those relationships. So if I was advising the administration right now, I would say dump cash and weapons on the Panjshiri Tajiks in the north. Not because they're going to win the war, not because they're going to launch a nationwide insurgency. They're not going to do that. But we need an island of autonomy from the Taliban. And that's what the Panjshiri Tajiks can do. That's what they did in the 1990s. They were the core of the Northern Alliance. They were the core of the Afghan army. And if they're still there, and they are still there, they vowed to fight on, dump money and weapons on them so they can defend themselves, in exchange for which they become our eyes and ears and our intelligence, so we can watch Al-Qaeda's reconstitution. That's our number one intelligence priority right now. Yeah, we need to know about what the Taliban's up to. I'm really afraid we don't know what is going on with Al-Qaeda or ISIS in Afghanistan right now. Yes.
Sorry, not to say this is, I read this from so many people in Washington. It's a flat Al-Qaeda is gone.
Sorry, what would you say?
Al-Qaeda is gone.
You
said that there is no safe haven, right, in Afghanistan, which have been repeated by the president, and as somebody who monitors this on a daily basis, I can tell you it's not true. So please, this is a flat line. Al-Qaeda just recently, Al-Qaeda General Command just waited until the last soldier is out of Afghanistan and they released a statement. I encourage you to read that statement. It's in English and in Arabic. You read it yourself and tell me if Al-Qaeda is gone or not. They say Al-Qaeda and Taliban are two separate entities. That's false, flat false. The Haqqani network, which helped the Taliban control all these districts and provinces, is Al-Qaeda, are Al-Qaeda fighters in essence. And why the US actually in the first place would go and sign a deal with Taliban if Al-Qaeda is not there. And so that's the whole myth, the whole lie that Al-Qaeda is gone is a flat lie and a flat false. So I hope that people will be aware before they speak anything what's going on the ground. Al-Qaeda has affiliates in more than all these affiliates, more than 30 statements hailed the victory of Taliban. Those are Al-Qaeda from Sahel region all the way to Syria. So tell me from where do you read these facts that no, there is no safe haven in Afghanistan?
So I didn't say there was no safe haven in Afghanistan. I just don't think it matters. I mean, there are other safe havens for Al-Qaeda. I think the biggest safe haven for Al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, right across the border, where Osama bin Laden was found hiding out in Pakistani West Point for 10 years, right? And I think that the biggest falsehood, though, and again, Paul and I disagree on this, is the relative importance of a physical safe haven in terms of the ability to attack Americans, especially at home, right? If you look at all of the failures that went into 9/11, The fact that Muhammad Atta got to hang out with Osama bin Laden and Tora Bora in 1998, 1989 is like a very, very small part of that failure, right? The failure to attack Al Qaeda under the Clinton administration, early Bush administration, was a failure more than anything of political will and of apathy because of a lack of understanding of the threat at high levels of the American government. Right? That is no longer a problem. Right? So we can do a lot of other things to restructure our approach to counterterrorism that do not revolve on having defending the existence of the Ghani government. Right? To include dumping money on the Panjshir on the Panjshir Valley. To include recruiting some of those 100,000 Afghan refugees who are very happy to be Americans today, recruiting them to work for the CIA. Many of them worked for the CIA for many years already in Afghanistan, right? That's a resource we did not have in 2001. In 2001, a friend of mine was a sophomore at Texas A&M, was recruited by the CIA on campus because he was one of maybe a handful of eligible American citizen native Pashto speakers, right? We don't have that problem anymore. So there are other approaches to attacking this problem. That's what I said.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that the Clinton administration's approach was a failure because last week's airstrike against ISIS reminded me of nothing so much as Bill Clinton's strategy, his cruise missile strikes on Afghanistan in 1998. We've just gone right back 25 years ago to pinprick strikes against terrorists, which didn't work back then.
Everyone, it's 7:30, but there's still plenty of time for you all to linger and ask questions of our speakers afterwards, if they're willing. So I appreciate your intelligent listening and question asking, and most especially the intelligent and very informative presentations by both of our speakers, John Askonas and Paul Miller. So thank you.